Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of currently streaming horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews may include mild spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy. The old saying goes, dying is easy, comedy is hard. And while this wasn't originally said in response to horror comedies, I think it's surprisingly apt. There have been an influx of horror comedies over the last decade, and if anything is certain, it's that most have not perfected the blending of the two genres. I often find horror comedies usually lean into one influence more than the other, which results in an uneven experience. Either the film is hilarious and its horror is severely lacking, or it has strong effects, but it's dreadfully unfunny. There are always exceptions, but I find myself struggling to find recent horror comedies that dance this genre-defining line, as well as they really should. Lars Dom Wazoo's 2019 zombie comedy Yummy dances this line surprisingly well, as it is a strong blend of gory practical zombie effects and sports some genuinely funny dark humor. Currently streaming on Shudder, Yummy is very much a plastic surgery dark comedy at its cold undead heart. A couple, Michael and Allison, visit a shady Eastern European plastic surgery clinic so Allison can get a breast reduction surgery. While exploring the hospital, Michael accidentally discovers and sets free Patient Zero, who's turned into a zombie as a side effect of the clinic's experimental rejuvenation treatment. Now, Michael and Allison and a group of survivors must make it out of the hospital with all the pieces they arrived with. Listen, its premise is more than silly. Lars' feelings on plastic surgery are blatantly apparent, as most of the film's gags revolve around exploiting those looking to alter their appearance. And for the most part, it actually works pretty well. I will note that there are a few instances of some really cringy sexist humor that feels out of place with the more cosmetic and actually funny gags. Gags such as liposuction procedure being interrupted by a gang of bloodthirsty zombies, and instead of sucking lipo, the machine begins pumping it to the point that the patient explodes, covering the zombies and survivors in fatty goo. Another scene involves a survivor being bitten, and when they attempt to amputate their arm with a fire axe, the head of the fire axe falls off. Thus, he must resort to using a paper shredder to amputate, but then accidentally takes off considerably more of the limb than he originally intended. The film's over-the-top, bloody dark humor moments like this make up for some of the sleazier characters and jokes. I'm pretty notorious in my friends group for hating sleazy horror movies. They just do little for me. And normally, Yummy sleaziness would be a deal breaker for me. But given the entire premise is wrapped around the setting being a sleazy Eastern European clinic, it kinda works better than it should. This resulted in my not particularly caring for any characters, but the jokes complement its pretty gross setting. Now, far too often in horror comedies that succeed in the humor department often neglect their horror effects. But in Yummy, the humor almost always works in tandem with the film's gory practical effects, which are terrific. There is of course the typical zombies simply eating people, and then there's Yummy's twisted brand of zombie humor, such as a zombie eating its own liposuction as it drips out of its perforated stomach, or a legless zombie running after people on its hands. A majority of the practical work is disgustingly lifelike, but there's always an added comedic element that has you laughing through your squeamish discomfort. I mean, unless we're talking about the scene where an asshole TV star's dick catches fire, and then freezes after being sprayed with a fire extinguisher before his unit completely falls off. You'll probably wince your way through that one. But even here, Dom Wazoo establishes characters enough that their deaths all feel justified to a certain degree. The film's kills are equally as brutal and bloody, with seemingly little expense spared that never allows the film to look overly cheap given its indie status. In fact, even its narrative structure's pacing is surprisingly well executed on. The only hiccup the film has is its characters, which are fairly vapid and not easily likable. With the exception of Michael, who's good-hearted but ultimately a fuck-up who constantly injures himself trying to protect Allison, though his sullen demeanor quickly grows tiresome, even if it does provide a few laughs. And then there's Allison, who despite seemingly being in love with Michael early on, quickly turns to Daniel, the drug addict clinic worker, for support. Meanwhile, Daniel is not only an addict, but the sleazy employee who tries to bang all the patients, including Allison. I never became interested in the relationship-focused moments and quickly grew tired of them, because they ultimately detracted from the film's actual humor and effects. The film also has a general mean-spiritedness to it that makes it difficult to predict who will make it out alive. Even those who act the most valiantly meet a worse fate than those who are more concerned with their own survival than others. While never the film's most impressive aspect, its story and performances are perfectly serviceable, considering it props up the film's stronger aspects. Overall, I was surprised by how much I enjoyed Yummy, given from the outside it is a seemingly run-of-the-mill zombie movie. And to some extent, that's true. But its blending of humor and zombie horror succeeds where most fail. It isn't constantly laugh-out-loud funny, but more often than not, its sick gags work, exploiting the shortcomings of characters in gruesome fashion. It's mean, it's dark, and it has some really strong zombie practical effects that show a dedication to horror that for some reason a lot of horror comedies are lacking. Or rather, most horror comedies operate under the assumption that by placing emphasis on one of the two genres it's blending together, excuses the other coming across as an afterthought. Yummy avoids this by not treating its horror elements as an afterthought, which allows its disturbing humor to truly shine, with equally disturbing visuals to boot. If you're a fan of horror comedies, especially zombie ones, or enjoy films such as Dead Snow, Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, or Shaun of the Dead, Yummy will be right up your alley. And that'll do it for another episode of Daily Horror Habit. I'll see you guys tomorrow for another Daily Horror Movie Review. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Daily Horror Habit podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service, and follow @Daily Horror Habit on Instagram or @Daily Horror Pod on Twitter.